so here we go. So the Akokisa show up, or the Europeans show up, and they start giving diseases to the Akokisa. They have no natural immunity. They had almost zero contact with any Europeans before that, so they get devastated. And they were a small group already. They moved around from spot to spot. They ate greenbrier root. They ate whatever they could hunt. But we know that they were poor for a couple of reasons in the archaeological records. One, we know that they practiced headboarding. Headboarding was common among poorer tribes that didn't have the means to carry their young. So what they would do is they'd take a flat piece of wood, and they would basically take leather straps and strap the kid to the wood, and the mother could carry them on their back. Well, when they did that, they would also strap the head down, because the newborn, you don't want his head moving around. So they strapped his head down. Most Akokisa skulls that have been found are misshapen, because as the heads grow, as the bones together are growing in together, they're being strapped down. So their heads are elongated. So we know that they practice headboarding. We also know from archaeological records and from Samaras Double Isle's account that the mothers nursed their children until they were 8 or 10 years old. Until you were old enough to physically go out and get your own food, that was your only way of getting sustenance. Because the mother's barely making enough for herself, finding enough food for herself. My goodness, I can't feed 2 or 3 other kids. So the kids were being nursed until they were 10 or 12 or 8 or 10 years old, and they were old enough to do this. The Double Isle talks about being part of the group, almost as a slave. And when they went hunting, they had horses, but they forced him to run alongside them, and would beat him if he fell behind. He went to war with them. So he talks about their method of fighting and their method of war. It was always small groups against small groups, but anybody that came into their territory, they considered an enemy unless they were invited in. Double Isle also talks about the fact that he was given to a widow woman as her concubine and fathered a child with her. So they were using him just like he was being used by them. But his story is very much similar to Cabeza de Vaca, except that Cabeza de Vaca had 4 other men that survived the shipwreck with him. Samaras Double Isle was shipwrecked with 9 people. All 8 died. He was the only one left alive when the Akokisa found him. We know for a fact that the Akokisa are the ones who found Cabeza de Vaca and Double Isle, because Cabeza de Vaca and Double Isle both identify them as the Han Indian, H-A-N. Well, because we know what the Akokisa language is, Han means house or home. So it makes sense that if you're asking, who are you? Oh, we're Han. This is our home. This is our house. So that's how we're almost 95% sure it was the Akokisas who found these people. The high bluff across from Jesse Jones Park has had several small archaeological digs done on it, but nothing full scale. And unfortunately, it's now owned by a developer. So the odds of it ever being fully explored are very small. The only other real large archaeological dig for the Akokisa has occurred along Cypress Creek by Collins Park, and then a big one down in Galveston that was dug twice, once in the 1970s, once in the 1990s. That's where we know that there's artifacts that dated back to literally 100 AD. The problem with the one in Galveston is they built a subdivision on top of it. It was Mitchell Ridge was the name of the dig, and it's Mitchell Ridge subdivision down on the west side of Galveston. So we don't have the ability now to continue to dig. And the more we lose land to development, to everything else, the less chance we are finding remnants and relics to fill in the gaps for these Akokisas. The dugout canoes that they built were amazing. All right, they built them out of bald cypress. You know how hard it is to cut a bald cypress down with a chainsaw? They were cutting them down with bone and stone tools. And then they hollowed these out. The Spanish, when they ran into them, said that their dugout canoes could fit 10 barrels end to end. A barrel's this tall. That's like 3 feet tall. That's 30 feet that these canoes were. They built them with fire. They would start the thing and they'd start hollowing it out. Every night when they got ready to take the campfire down, they'd take the coals, set the coals inside the stump or the log, and let the coals burn the log down overnight. And they'd come in the next day with their tools and chip it out and start it over the next day. It might take months to make one canoe. It was their most prized possession. When Hurricane Rita hit down in Galveston and the storm surge happened, remember that big storm surge pushed all the sand up into the strand and everything? It pushed 2 canoes up out of Galveston Bay. They were estimated to have been built in the 1400s. They were still seaworthy. They still floated. I don't know what happened. One of them supposedly went to the museum in Galveston, but I've never seen it on display, so I don't know what actually happened to it. And the only reason I know about it, I remember reading a story about it, and then I contacted some people from Galveston that I know and said, yeah, that really happened. So these canoes that they built, these things were meant to last. You know, bald cypress doesn't rot. You can put it in water and it's perfectly fine. So you get it in that salt water, it stayed preserved, and for whatever reason they had sunk them. But that story that the Akokisa is about helping the Americans in the American Revolution, I found that fascinating. That's something, I studied the American Revolution, and I don't remember ever seeing stories about the Spanish driving cattle to the American Army. But I found it in 4 different records. Okay, so this is not one source that I actually saw a clip about it in the Texas State Historic Association online. And if you have ever gone to that, you know, it's all the articles ever written. I mean, there's little things about everything in Texas history, but they're very nicely footnoted. So if you see something you like, you go down, it gives you the source material that you can go check out. So I saw this little article, and I was like, man, that can't be true. I started researching it, and sure was. There were about 40 Akokisa and some Spanish vaqueros that drove a herd of cattle to Tennessee from Texas. First real cattle drive ever out of Texas. Galvez wanted to attack the Bahamas with his army, okay, because it was a British colony, and the Akokisa refused to get on the big boats. So they came around and turned back home. That's why they didn't invade the Bahamas. But the Akokisa spent half their time on Galveston, and you think about it, they spent the summers on Galveston. The Karankawa spent the winters on Galveston. Okay, that winters are much better time to be on Galveston Island. You're not worried about hurricanes. The oysters are good to eat because the months all have R's in them. Okay, the fish are closer to the bay because of the cold water in the bay. So the Karankawa, who are very warlike, claimed Galveston during the good season. The Akokisa, who were less warlike, took the remnants, which meant that they went during the summer when it was hurricane weather, when the fish were harder to catch, the oysters weren't good to eat. So they had the time while they were there of the same problem, always in search of food. That was always what they were searching for, food, 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 everything they did. So the archaeological records on Galveston Island, most everything that's found down there is Karankawa dated, which was why the Mitchell Preserve or the Mitchell Ridge site was so important, because it was definitely Akokisa. The Karankawa had access to stone tools earlier because they traded and took them from the natives to the further west. The Akokisa were like the 15 to 1600s before they started trading for stone. So anything predated that went stone had to be Karankawa. Everything that was bone was still Atakapa or Akokisa. But like I said, the natives, the story about these people is just lost. We just don't have anybody that's really researching. There was a lady that I met probably 17 or 18 years ago who claimed to have Takapa and Akokisa blood. And she was a curator down at the Houston Museum. She was one of their docents down there. And she used to come out to Jones Park and talk to me and a couple of our other reenactors and historian type people about the Akokisa. And she took me to a place where she said that there's a mound that's not Caddo, that was actually Akokisa. It's up in New Caney. Now, that's the only time I've ever seen anything about the Akokisa building mounds, But she swears it was her family oral history that was an Akokisa site, not a Caddo site. So again, we don't know this though because we're not able to dig. The state of Texas, and I heard you with the archaeological stuff, she can tell you the state of Texas has no money for archaeology. I mean, it's very hard to get them to come dig places. So they're relying on independent and smaller groups to come out and do that. But I have a site, like I said, across from Jones Park in Montgomery County. I would love to have that dug. That high bluff is not only unique because of the native presence up there, it's an environmental wonder. It's an elevated cypress bog. If you go up on that high bluff and stand at the bluff, it's probably 80 feet above the creek. You walk back in about 100 yards, and there's a second little indentation there. It's an elevated cypress bog. It's probably about 40 feet higher than the creek. I've never seen an elevated cypress bog, but it's an absolutely amazing piece of property there. And so you go over there, and he's got this, and all the springs are still there. You can walk around, see where the resurrection fern's on the ground. Go kick the dirt a little bit, and you got fresh water bubbling up. I've had it tested. It's potable. I don't drink it, but it is potable. So you've got these places that we still need to get out there and visit and see and do. But again, we just don't get to them, and unfortunately, they're all getting covered up by modern society. So anyways, anybody have any questions about the Akokisa? Yes, yeah.
I was curious, like your video talked about the latest generation of Akokisa
Right.
here in the Tomball area. Do you know roughly where that might be?
Somewhere between Burroughs Park and Gosling Road, that area, like the Huffsmith area, kind of. I don't know exactly where it is. I've had different old timers tell me different places, but everybody kind of agrees it's out there, kind of Burroughs and east. So yes.
So what did since they're a poor tribe and they spend so much time looking for food,
Right.
what did they have to trade that the people in the West would trade stone?
They traded asphaltum, which was
Okay.
yeah, and red ochre. That was their two main trade items. They also made Bodark bows. The Caddos and them both made the bows that were traded country-wise. If you know what Bodark is, the horse apple tree, that wood is a beautiful bright orange. It's extraordinarily strong, but also pliant. So the French named it Bodark, Ark of the Bow, because it's the best bow-making wood that they had found in the United States. And the Caddo and the Akokisa made bows that were traded all the way up to the Great Lakes and all the way to both coasts. They found Bodark bows there. Yes?
Try driving a nail.
Oh, I know. I know. And they're thorny, and they're hard to work, but they make great. But they're very pliant once they get made. I actually have a gentleman who made me a Bodark bow, traditional. So it's over at Jesse Jones Park on display. But yeah, so asphaltum, which was used for glue and thatching, and then the red ochre, which was for dyes and for tattooing. All Native Americans practice some sort of tattooing. One of the reasons the Karankawa were considered so fierce, the descriptions of the early Texas settlers and the Spanish were that they were all over 6 feet tall. Some of the men were 7 feet. The women were all over 6 feet tall as well. They tattooed their entire bodies from head to toe. They would have anywhere between 50 and 100 piercings. And they were butt naked. And they used alligator fat to fight mosquitoes. So you think about this. The average Spanish and American at the time were about 5'4". You've got a group of Native Americans who they say are over 6'6". They're tattooed, pierced, butt naked, and smell god awful. You'd be afraid of them too. But they used the tattooing. The Karankawas are actually pretty cool. They linguistically is how they categorize Native Americans in North America, by what language group you're part of. The Karankawa are a unique language to North America. The only other natives who talk in that dialect are the Caribs, who were found in the Caribbean islands by Columbus. So the hypothesis is that at some point in their history, the Carib Indians floated canoes and island hopped till they got to Florida, and then just came along the coast till they ended up in Matagorda Bay. Now, I don't know if they'll ever prove that, but linguistically, that's the only native group that they're related to. Another southeast, or a little further southeast native tribe. But, so anybody else have questions about the, yes?
How was the family unit organized?
The mother was in charge, and the children married, and they came in and lived with the mother's family.
Were they monogamous?
Yes, they were monogamous. So again, they were spiritual in their own way as well. Yeah, but nobody's ever said anything about them being non-monogamous. In fact, Belial was given to a widowed woman because she didn't have another husband. So.
And did the kids have jobs right away? Were they?
As soon as they were old enough, and again, most of their jobs were either collecting food, tanning hides, thatching huts. They used grass mats. That way they could be mobile. You know, you take a grass mat, you weave it for your house coverings, and what they would do is they'd find 8 or 10 yopons that were close in a group, bend them over, tie them down, and throw the grass mats over top of them, and leave them for the week or two that they were there. They got ready to leave, roll the mats up, cut the string off of the Yopon. Yopon goes back to where it was. You can use them again next year when you come through the same area.
Did they have defined jobs as men and women?
Not that I'm aware. Well, other than traditional, like hunting would have been the male job. The gathering was more the female job. But other than that, yeah.
They did it all.
Yeah, everybody did it all. Because again, it was no different than the early pioneers that got here. Everybody thinks that there was always male and female jobs on a farm. Very rarely were there anything that male or female. Women knew how to blacksmith. They knew how to do woodworking. They might not have hunted as much, but they were tending the gardens and doing everything else around the house. So.
It looked like on your video you had some recreations of what the village might have looked at with the palmetto.
Yeah, that's actually at Jesse Jones Park.
Oh, it is.
They have a replica of an 1800s pioneer homestead, as well as a Akokisa Indian village. The village itself has gotten smaller. We don't have access to the same number of palmettos that we used to have. So they've had to decrease the size of the village. When I first started working, I think there were 9 structures, and it literally took us tons of palmettos to cover them all. And now I think there's 6. So they've downsized a little bit. We have to go to Montgomery County to get the palmettos. It's an old oil field up there that has these giant palmettos everywhere, but unfortunately the oil company has sold some of that property to private owners. We don't have access to the whole property anymore, so our stash is getting smaller and smaller. So, anybody else? Questions? No?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
The Frenchman that you were referencing,
Mm-hmm.
was he part of the group that was supposed to build a fort on the Trinity?
No.
Style? It was
No.
him?
Belial was a group that was.
I've heard the name. But I
Yeah,
can't remember.
he was with a group that was mapping the Gulf Coast. His captain, and he was a nobleman, okay, and he was a junior officer on the boat. Apparently, he had been feuding with the captain, and the captain set him and a group of men off on Galveston Island to collect wood and fresh water, and then sailed away without them. Just left them, marooned them on Galveston Island. They tried to do like everybody else did, try to walk off the island. They made it as far as the Trinity River and couldn't get past the Trinity River along the coast. So they turned around and came back to Galveston. Then they decided they were going to try to walk to Mexico. At least there's other Europeans, and they got stuck at the Brazos and had to come back. So they basically walked up and down the coast until they were malnourished and died. Belial was living on maggots from driftwood. That was what he was surviving on. So anything. So being captured by the Indians and they didn't kill him, that was a bonus. That was a good thing. So yes. So anybody else? So like I said, the Revelation, you can actually Google Kabeza Devaka and you can read his actual writings, and you can also read Bilal's if you Google his name, and they're both public domain. They're both online to read. You don't even have to buy anything anymore. But like I said, the Native Americans, I'm fascinated with the history of them because they did everything the way that I think everybody should live. You're taking from the land, also replenishing the land. And in modern society, we take, but we don't always give back. And we need to replant, we need to regrow, we need to repurpose. We have all these buildings where they build these giant parking, or these giant shopping centers that 10 years later there's nobody in them anymore. But instead of repurposing those, they go out and build another brand new one. So now we've got these empty giant storefronts with nobody in them. Why don't we repurpose what we're using? Why do we have to continue just to gobble up every acre of farmland, every acre of forest land? There's got to be a better way. And I look to the Native Americans as the stewards of all that. They really did. They took what they needed and they always gave back. So I'm fascinated with Native culture. I have a little Native blood in me, like pretty much anybody whose family's been here for 300 years, got some little Native blood in them somewhere. But my family's from Western Pennsylvania, and my grandfather used to take me when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, and he knew where there were 3 or 4 old remnants of Indian villages. He also knew where every mining camp and every lumber camp that had been abandoned was. And we'd walk up through those woods in Pennsylvania, and he'd walk up to this old village and say, "Hell yeah, 80 years ago or 70 years ago, this was a mining town. It was booming." And there'd be 6 or 7, partial structures up, and he'd give me this whole history about all of it. He knew where there was like 9 or 10 private cemeteries on these properties, and he never told me. I wanted a map from him, and he would never give me a map. He says, "No, it's up in here. It's up in here." Well, you're not here anymore, Grandpa, so I don't know where it's at. But he never told the Pennsylvania commissions where these cemeteries were because he was afraid they were going to come in there and not treat them with the respect that they needed. So, but Western Pennsylvania has a lot of old mill towns and old mining towns. They did a really cool thing where they took the old railroad line that used to run to connect all these mining towns. It's not an active railroad anymore. They turned it into a bike trail. So now there's a bike trail. It's like 120 miles long through Pennsylvania that basically goes through all these little ghost towns. It's really cool along the railroad. So
I was wondering if you have any other interests about North Harris County that you've been researching, or
I have about 30 different PowerPoints, all of them related to early Texas, some of them specific to North Harris County. I do one about the 3 main economies in Harris County, which were farming, lumber, and rail. I also do one about the German settlement of Harris County. So I do several of those. But I do a lot of things that are more generic, like pre and post Texas Revolution. I do some about the old 300. I also do a series of things about the Republic of Texas, because not everybody knows that little 10 or 12 year period right there, how much really went on. Same thing, I do a series of things about the antebellum Texas. That first years of statehood and the population increase. And some of that's centered on Harris County because that's my audience. I have a little tidbit about Harrisburg. When it was first built in 1838, there were still a lot of soldiers from the Texas Revolution who were milling around in Harrisburg waiting for their land grants. And there was a newspaper article that said that there were 47 bars in Harrisburg and the population was less than 3,000. So I've got little tidbits that I find, all kinds of stuff. I try to incorporate these stories into my presentations. I am not a names and dates historian per se. I don't think it's important to know names and dates. I'm more of cause and effect. And everybody knows what July 4th, 1776 is, right? That's the date I always use. Everybody knows what it is. What caused it and what happened after? Most people don't understand the underlying reasons that July 4th, 1776 happened, and they don't completely understand everything that happened after that. So I try to use cause and effect. I'm also a living historian. I do historical reenactments, both Texas Revolution and Civil War. I've also done some more of 1812 stuff in the past. So I like to live it. I like to go out in primitive camp. I like to read diaries. That's my favorite source material if I can find them. History books are great, but all history books are written with an agenda. Okay, and it's always told by what the person writing it wants you to know. So I try to read diaries because they're more factual, more out there. And I also try to read the losing sides stories, because most history books are obviously written by the winners. The losers have a story to tell too. And you don't really get the whole story of anything, especially warfare or wars or conquests, without actually seeing the other side's story. The North and the South both have stories to tell. The British and the Americans both have stories to tell about the Revolution. Even the Germans during World War I and World War II, the Germans have a story to tell. And not every German was a follower of Adolf Hitler. These were patriotic, for the most part, patriotic people who got caught up in something that wasn't their doing. And if you read their stories, you understand that their struggles were just the same as ours. And but movies and Hollywood and books tend to villainize the other side. Same way with the Native Americans. For years, for 100 years, Hollywood and books and everything, history books, the Native Americans were barbarians. They were scalping people, and they were doing all that. Native Americans didn't scalp. You know who taught them how to scalp? The French fur traders. The Native Americans didn't scalp people. The traders were getting bounties on Native Americans. The way you would prove you killed one was bringing their scalp back. Europeans taught them how to be barbaric. Native Americans were not like this. They were warlike, yeah, and they did some atrocious things too. But scalping's not one of them. That was taught them by Europeans. So we read all this stuff and we get this look in our head, Hollywood, the Native Americans were savages and barbarians. They weren't. They were just human beings like us trying to defend their land. Think about this. If you were living here in Tomball and a group of people came in and said, hey, we like your land, we're going to take it, y'all move. You're not going to do that sitting down. You're going to fight for it. And they were fighting for their land. So I always try to factor in what these people were doing. And if it was me, I try to teach from a perspective. If that was me, what would I do to defend my land? What would I do to live? How would I feed my family? Okay, I've taken lots of classes here in Harris County. I can pretty much tell you almost every edible and medicinal plant that's found out here. Because if something were to happen, I want to know how to feed my family. Okay? Everybody, it's important to live that way. And I try to live that way when I go on these reenactments. I'll go for a week at a time sometimes and just go primitive camping. We catch what we eat or cook what we eat. And I actually had before the Spring Creek Greenway Trail started going in, I was in the process of hiking the entire trail along Spring Creek from Waller, where it started, all the way to the San Jacinto River. And it was going to take me several trips to take bites of it because I couldn't take it off the whole time. It's very heavily forested, and I was basically going to have to hack and slash my way through the forest, staying along the creek as much as possible so I was out of private property. But I was going to take a little pup tent, I was going to take a little 22 and a breakdown fishing pole and a pot and pan. And that was all I was going to take. and I was only going to eat what I could find or what I could catch. I was only going to drink the water I could boil off and make good. And I started on this trip, and then Commissioner Cagle found out about it, and he invited himself along on my trip. And when he invited himself along on my trip, it became less primitive. We were staying the nights in our parks, and the park managers of those parks were cooking this big barbecue. I think I actually gained weight on those trips when I was going with Commissioner Cagle. But I've actually seen all of Spring Creek from the creek, from Waller all the way to San Jacinto River. I'm very lucky to have done that before the Spring Creek Greenway all went in. Now, again, you can see a lot of it, especially on the eastern end from the Spring Creek Greenway now, because there's 15 miles of it built from Humboldt all the way to Rothwood. But it's completely different when you see it when it was the way it was supposed to be. It's very quiet, it's very peaceful, and it reminds you, that Spring Creek is the only body of water in all of Harris County that's never been channeled. The only one that's still pristine to where it was when the settlers got here. And that to me is an amazing thing, and you guys live right on it. And I know it floods occasionally and causes some problems, but here's the thing, it does what it's supposed to do. Spring Creek is a kidney. It's the health of the area. When it floods, it brings nutrients up to feed your fields and the farmlands that used to be all out here. And, so it works as it's supposed to do as a filter system for the area. So when you have floods, you just have to take it as that's just Mother Nature needs a cleaning. And that's what we're doing. So anyway, thank y'all all very much for having me.